All right, we kick off with Nigeria. We just got those GDP figures for the third quarter of 2024, 3.46%. There it is, year on year in quarter three, higher than what we had in quarter two, which was 3.19, also higher than this same time last year, 2.54%. And then, in case you're curious, for the full year of 2023, 2.74%. So it looks like we could be on track to beat that for fiscal year 2024. Let's talk to our guest, the policy analyst, also the co-founder of Veriv Africa, Basil Abia. He's in our Abuja studios. Basil, good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So let me first get your take, Basil, on the 3.46% figure. What is your takeaway from that figure, year-on-year growth?
Good afternoon, Rochas. It's a pleasure to be here. My take is very simple, very muted and staggered growth, not sufficient for our population size and the context of our population growth rate. We have a population growth rate of about 2.5 or 2.6% on the yearly basis, and we need to be able to equalize that or surmount that with significant growth every quarter. And if we're doing just under 4% every quarter, and an average of 3% every year, then we have a problem. As you do know, of course, both the IMF and, of course, Veriv Africa have worked on the outlook for 2025, and part of that work was also working on what the outlook for the entire aggregate GDP growth rate for Nigeria would be in 2024. And IMF are reporting 3.2%. We're also reporting 3.2% as well. So these are very minuscule growth numbers that are not enough. And if you even look into the details, for instance, reading the MBS report in depth, covering all the sectors, you see that it's still the same thing. It's still services driving growth. Very little contributions, of course, from where we think we can see significant growth levels. For instance, mining, productive sectors who are into manufacturing, of course, and processing. So it's still the same. Even agriculture, GDP contribution from agriculture is 28%, still not past that 30% that we needed to pass. A core reason of that, of course, is that we lack a lot of processing capabilities down the food production value chain. So if you look at it again, like I said, in depth, the perspective from my end and from my own company as well, most of the analysts and economists on the team strongly believe that that number is too small for the level of growth Nigeria deserves. We need to be doing 6% or above. We can manage 5%, but 6% and above changes a lot of things for all of us. And that's just the truth.
It is, and I mean, we haven't seen 6% growth since, over a decade ago. Look, oil is going to be very critical to where we get to. I wanted to get your thoughts on the oil production figures for Q3. We're at 1.47, and we just wanted to let people know where this new administration came in, 1.2. So they've already talked about wanting to get oil production to 2 million or more, which is where we were, at least before the pandemic hit us. What do you make of the trajectory of oil production for the country?
I'll start with a sense of humor a bit. Did NNPC sign off on that number? Because everyone keeps reporting 1.8 million from NNPC.
Nice one.
But yeah, 1.47 million is a step in the right direction. Of course, the target should be 1.8 million or above, especially considering the contribution of our FX earnings from oil exports. Knowing that a number of that is also tied to debt servicing. I'll say this: if you're doing $75 per barrel, which is what Brent crude is doing now in the market, your target should be 1.8 million to 2 million, so that you're able to increase FX earnings in that sense. And then when FX earnings come in, they reduce the pressure on the naira. As you do know, of course, because there's an exchange rate pass-through to our inflation starts to reduce, take a nosedive. That's the target. I think that's the target for policy analysts. That's the target for public policy makers, especially folks that are working in the Ministry of Finance. So we need to do everything we have to do possible, all the kinetic and non-kinetic measures to make sure that we look at our security situation in the upstream sector, all of the contractual situation too in the upstream sector. When we're able to sort that out, then we can start to see a significant increase in those numbers back to our 2 million barrel per day numbers. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to hack 2 million per barrel or above, and that's a number that we're comfortably doing in the 1970s and the 1980s. Says a lot about our country and our society that we haven't hacked multi-generational growth, because we're doing even lower numbers than where we were in the 1970s and the 1960s. So it's quite unfortunate, but it is what it is right now. And for public policy makers, for people in government, the sole goal is to ramp up those production numbers to 1.8 million and then 2 million. Once we get that, then we stand a chance. That's just the truth. If you're doing 70% of the country's earnings, even though you're doing very minuscule numbers in terms of GDP contribution, but if you're contributing 70% or more, historically it's been 90% actually, but if you're contributing 70% or more to the country's earnings, then surely we have to take it seriously. And unfortunately, we have not seen that in the last 10 years. It's almost like the national cake is shrinking, and then everybody is watching as the national cake is shrinking and not doing anything about it. Like, if you want to eat the cake, surely you have to replenish. And that's just the analogy I'm going to use here, the metaphor I'll use here.
Hey, look, I like your analogies, I like your metaphors. The oil sector, if we look further into the growth, 5.17% year on year in Q3. Contributing about a little over 5% in the third quarter, 5.57, there we go. But yet, you just mentioned the FX earnings. You contrast this against non-oil, which did, contribute about 94.43% and grew at 3.37, yet doesn't contribute as much, nowhere near in terms of FX earnings. And we talk about diversifying our economy away from oil. What do you make of the dynamic here between low contribution to the GDP, but high contribution in FX earnings for oil versus high contribution to the economy, but very low contribution in terms of FX for non-oil? What do you make of that dichotomy, if you will?
Yeah, so it's a very old, age-long, time-honored dichotomy. As you know, many folks in the policy analysis space have always highlighted that. But I think for me, it's a basic math and unit value, I'd say, table in that sense. And what I'm trying to say here is that if you do the math, if you're selling 1 barrel of oil for $75, of course, as we do know, of course, it's the Brent crude is about $75 per barrel, and you're selling 1.47 million barrels of that on average every day. The math will give you $110 million US, or slightly over $110 million US every day. So if you do the math, number of 365 days averagely, that should be $40 billion US in earnings. What did we earn in 2023? We earned about $57 billion US in our exports. So oil and non-oil exports. So basically, based on my math, that should be roughly $40 billion US out of $57 billion US earned last year. And a chunk of that came from oil. So it's a unit value issue. I'll give you an example. Non-oil exports, the largest non-oil export in Nigeria to date is still cocoa. Last year we did over 280,000 tons, metric tons, tons actually, 280,000 plus tons of cocoa. That's what we sold. A ton goes for $10,000 US. If you look at the market, I think last year it was around 9,900 or thereabout. But let's just use the 10,000 tons number. Now multiply against the unit value, like to be able to extrapolate the unit value. Now, if you do the 10,000 per ton, multiplying by the 280,000 tons that we sold, the number is significantly lower. So we need to be able to do not only a multiplicity of that. Yes, the economy is diverse, with the explanation you provided, but it's a unit value issue here. 1 barrel gives you $70 and you're doing 1.47 million barrels. Hopefully 1.5 million barrels in the next quarter for Q4. Whatever that gives you, you have to just weigh the options. So what I would imply here, or what I'm trying to imply here, is that it's important to get not only more value from our non-oil exports, and that includes, like I said much earlier, engendering value chain processes, especially in our processing components of every single non-oil export. A typical example of that would be in cocoa. We're supposed to be adding a bit of value. Not a bit, we should be adding significant value to the chocolate industry out there globally. But we do nothing. We just I think I read the financial year report for the makers of Nutella and Russia. For those who have been doing a number of Valentine purchases, Russia, of course, get a number of their cocoa units. They get it from Nigeria. So why can't we not give them more than just the raw cocoa or the cocoa state that is processed by the first stage? Why can't we not give them the second stage or third stage? Why can't we not have cocoa companies, chocolate confectionery companies and chocolate companies also dominate the chocolate market, go toe-to-toe with Mars? That's how you do productive value unit, by increasing those unit values. When you're adding the processing components to the value chain and you're doing value chain entrenchment across the entire sphere. We also need to be able to get mining up. Like I said, the analysis of the GDP report by the MBS that just came out today is still hovering around 3%. We should be doing 7 to 10% for mining and quarrying. We can do that once we get the majors in. But how do you get the majors in? The fiscal incentives have to be set right. Security has to be set in stone. So there's a lot of governance from policy to security governance, and we're not seeing a lot of that. Kudos to the Ministry of Mining, especially Kayode Fayeme's time. They did a lot of heavy lifting when it came to policy frameworking, and we're seeing the benefits of policy frameworking, because whether we like it or not, the mining sector is at the highest activity rate. Anybody who has spoken with anybody in mining, they'll tell you just that. The problem is the insecurity and the lack of structure. It's affecting the majors from seeing the mining space as attractive. I can go on and on and on for other manufacturing subset. You know the data from the Manufacturing Association of Nigeria for 2023, 700 plus manufacturing concerns or companies have since shut down. What's the bulk of their concern? It's the energy price volatility. And when you're doing 35 to 40% of your cost of production borne by energy, you have to find a way to fix that. And that's something that both policy governance and energy security governance can provide for you. So yeah, I think that would be my commentary on that.
Fantastic stuff, Basil. We could be here for an hour if we broke down all these sectors. Let me end on your report that you just released, your 2025 outlook. You've got for GDP growth for 2025, best case over 3%, I believe. You've got a base case and then a worst case. Can you just quickly, about a minute or so, talk us through? Yeah, there it is. So 3.64% best case, 3.1 base case, 2.53 worst case. Well, quickly walk us through this for what the triggers are.
Yeah, so like I said, again, using my analogy, the FX earnings, the influence from the oil sector, the influence of the oil prices, global oil prices. So for the worst case scenario, if global oil prices tank to lower than $70 per barrel, our assumption is that that's going to make the economy tank. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the Naira because FX earnings and foreign exchange inflow will be scarce. And the more scarcity, of course, that causes a lot of pressure on the Naira. The more pressure on the Naira, exchange through inflation happens, inflation is heightened. So you're seeing an average inflation rate of about 36%. That's what we're predicting for 2025 based on our projections. That projection also ties down to the 2.53 GDP growth, real growth rate that we're also projecting. We're also projecting 1,900 to 2,000 Naira per dollar in the parallel market rate. So if you're doing 2,000 Naira per dollar, you know what that does to inflation rate. I can go on and on. Actually, we're also predicting 1,500 Naira per liter when it comes to PMS prices, aggregate PMS prices for 2025. That's, again, the trigger would be that if we are able, unfortunately, if the global oil prices are lower than $70, then we're going to get that. The reason for that is that a Trump presidency can ramp up oil production in the short time, and in that short term, that causes something close to an oil glut, and that oil glut reduces the global oil prices, which is currently at $75 per barrel. So for base case scenario is if the geopolitical tensions are still not heightened in that sense, if Trump doesn't do much in terms of ramping up oil exploration, and if we don't see a lot of changes from policy outcomes, for instance, the tax reform bills is going to take a long time before there's a policy transmission, a lag that is reached. And so in that sense, we're not expecting a lot of things to happen. And if our assumptions are right, then we should be able to do 3.1% GDP real growth rate. That will be our projection for base case scenario. And for best case scenario, if things go really well, our assumption is that for things to go well, we need to be able to see global crude oil prices at $90 per barrel. And then outside of $90 per barrel, we're also expecting that some of the lag effects will start to take effect. And the lag effects I'm talking about, the policy transmission lag effect here I'm talking about, is that of the tax reform bills. If the tax reform bills now become acts, the National Revenue Service get their acts on and start to ease out a number of these modalities, and we see a ramp up in revenue mobilization, domestic revenue mobilization, then we can definitely see effects in terms of non-oil revenues for the federal government to be able to use. And then, of course, we're expecting that GDP growth rates will be 3.64%. We're also expecting that PMS prices will be around 1,100 per litre. And then we're expecting the dollar to be at 1,300 naira per dollar in the parallel market rate. Parallel market. So those are our assumptions, and that's how we walked across and came across our own projections for 2025 for Nigeria.
Great stuff. Basil Abia, we've got to have you back on the show. Fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for checking out that report. We encourage all our viewers to go download it and read up on it. That's Basil Abia. He is, of course, the policy analyst, co-founder at Veriv Africa, talking us through economic growth in Nigeria.